So today is May 31st, 2023. I'm here with Dr. Paul Ortiz, the director of the Semiopractor History Program. So thank you very much, Professor Ortiz, for giving us a little bit of your time to talk about SPOHP and to talk about the importance of this amazing program at the University of Florida. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Helio. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. So let's get started with your name and you telling us about when and how you started working in the program.
Yeah. Well, my name is Paul Ortiz. I'm a professor of history, and I currently direct the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. I'm the third director in the history of our program. We were founded in 1967 by Sam Proctor. Now, Dr. Sam Proctor was a longtime historian. He was actually the university historian at UF. He did his PhD here after serving in World War II. And our second director was Julian Pleasance. He was also a military veteran. We're actually unique among oral history programs as far as I know. All of our directors have been military veterans. And really the strength of our program, before I kind of get into the questions, that very important question that you started us with, the strength of the program is in people like you. I mean, you're a graduate student at UF History Department. You're eventually a PhD candidate. And really the secret of our success is the brilliance of our students, our graduate students, our undergraduates, the volunteers, the faculty who volunteer to help with the program. My work with oral history began many years ago. I actually never took an oral history course as an undergraduate. I don't recall that being offered. And it's interesting, when I talk to a lot of my fellow directors and people around my age who do oral history now, a lot of us kind of laugh about the fact that, we never had oral history courses. I mean, some of the bigger universities had those types of courses. Mm-hmm. My introduction, I guess, to storytelling, though, I grew up mainly in a small shipyard town, military shipyard town. And I grew up around a lot of military veterans, and they were just tremendous storytellers. And some of the stories were very tragic, and that always had a big impact on me because I never had to worry about people who just told about like the sunny side of life, because you grow up, you serve in war, you serve in the military, you see a lot of terrible things. And so I heard about both the good and the bad. And many years later, when I went into military, and I served in the 82nd Airborne Division and 7th Special Forces in Central America, when I was in Central America, I was really challenged in my beliefs about the United States because I'd grown up very ignorant of my country. I mean, I've been given a certain narrative about the United States, mm-hmm. but when I left the country and started talking to people in Latin America, they told me a very different version of the United States history than I had been taught. And so when I came home, now this didn't happen to me all at once. It was a slow process. But I did vow when I returned back to the United States to try to get to the bottom of what was going on in my country's history. And our people had never really felt fully a part of the nation. My grandparents arrived here as refugees from the Mexican Revolution in 1914. And most of them from that generation had planned to return to Mexico after things kind of calmed down. And some of them did, but for whatever reason, my elders didn't return permanently. And so they stayed in mainly El Paso, Houston, San Antonio, Texas, and other places, Baytown, and whatnot. And so our only claim to citizenship was really military service. We were not a wealthy people. We didn't have a lot of resources. And so all those things kind of came together. When I returned to the U.S., pretty shortly afterwards, I was asked to take in a group of refugees from Central America. And the people that I was working with, and I didn't know this at the time, but this was called the Sanctuary Movement. And it was kind of part of the Latin American solidarity movement where a lot of times religious communities or political communities in the United States would provide sanctuary to people fleeing from Central America. And a lot of people in the U.S. didn't understand why there were so many people leaving countries like El Salvador, Honduras, Colombia, et cetera, et cetera. But I could tell them firsthand, I could tell them exactly why people were leaving. Yeah. And I would say, well, you don't know what our country is doing to the people of Latin America. People didn't want to hear that. Americans want to hear that our country, my country, right or wrong, and we always have well-meaning and
bring democracy.
We bring democracy everywhere, and that is not always the case. And so this is why many of these people had to flee. And so it was a real sobering experience for me. And I actually did radio for a while, and this was my entry into oral history. And the reason I did radio was I was working as an organizer with the United Farm Workers Union in the late 80s, early 90s. And we were working on a campaign. It was a Chateau Saint Michel wine boycott in Washington State. And Chateau Saint Michel was owned by a powerful corporation called U.S. Tobacco, one of the world's largest corporations. And a group of farm workers wanted the right to join a union. And they wanted the right to join the UFW and the right to just vote for union representation. And the company resisted and stonewalled and fired and harassed a lot of people. And so the union called a boycott of the company. And that was my introduction into the labor movement. And so I was working with the workers to try to make that happen, to build a boycott, to present their stories to people in cities like Tacoma, Seattle, Olympia, the state capital of Washington. And I realized at a certain point, the media coverage we were getting was just awful. It was terrible. The U.S., in the United States, we love leaders. We love powerful men. We love caudillos, frankly. People like Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, Ronald Reagan, powerful white men. What we don't like is working class people who fight against the system. And I learned this because it didn't matter if it was National Public Radio or so-called liberal media or conservative media, our union struggles never got good coverage. They always misquoted workers. They always misrepresented. I don't think they were doing it on purpose even in many cases. I just think that the media in the U.S. is just very much, pro-employer, pro-big business. And whenever there is a wealthy billionaire white man like Elon Musk or Bill Gates, it doesn't matter their politics even. It's just that they're wealthy and they're white, and they'll get coverage. And this was long before social media, by the way. But anyway, so I decided that, and there's a history in the farm worker movement of starting our own radio programs to when there's the opportunity there, to at least get a regional coverage. And so I started a program called Pathways to Justice. This was actually an international labor affairs program, but I was running a lot of shows on the Saint Michel boycott and other labor struggles that were happening. And one of my first interviews, the first live interview that I did was with a group of women who were from Guatemala. They spoke an indigenous language, and they had been in a Christian-based community that had been massacred by the Guatemalan government. And I knew that that this massacre and the support had been made possible by the United States. And so we brought in the women to speak. We had a person translating from the indigenous language to Spanish and then to English. And it was just this incredibly intense interview where the women talked about surviving rape, violence, and what was really later called genocide of indigenous people in Guatemala, which again had been empowered by the United States, by Israel, by other colonial powers who were all in Central America when I was there. Now, when I was in the military, I was never in Guatemala, but I knew guys who went up there, and we kind of, we parsed it. The British were there, the French were there, the Israelis were there, the U.S. was the biggest presence, but it was just a terrible situation. So I felt that the least I could do was to try to give a voice to people undergoing this oppression and these struggles. And so that really got me hooked on, I didn't know I was doing oral history at the time, but that's really what I was doing. And so I was recruited to a PhD history program at Duke University, and I was recruited to work specifically in a project called Behind the Veil, documenting African American life in the Jim Crow South. And that was a National Endowment for the Humanities supported program.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about that NEH project was it was designed to recruit and support students like me, like non-traditional students of color. And not only was it about interviewing African American elders about growing up in the Jim Crow South, but it was about the recruitment of a new kind of non-traditional graduate student. So when I started graduate school, I had an incoming class of about 20 students at Duke. The great majority were from a lot of them were frankly from old money. They were very wealthy, affluent backgrounds. I had a great time in grad school because most of my time was out doing field work, interviewing people in Macon County, Alabama, in the Black Belt, in the Arkansas Delta, in northern Florida, Memphis, Tennessee, Birmingham, Alabama. And that Behind the Veil project, I ended up doing over about 200 oral histories.
Wow.
And that's all I did as a graduate student, by the way. I never TA'd, I never taught, I never graded.
That's awesome.
Just because there's so many interviews to do in a short period of time, and people would call and they would say, we have a 93-year-old elder who needs to be interviewed. Can you do it? And so that took priority over like grading, for example.
Yes.
And so Duke had the resources because of the NEH grant to be able to send me out into the field. And that's how I kind of developed my own academic, intellectual approach, more of a fieldwork kind of oriented approach. And so when I graduated from Duke and I taught at UC Santa Cruz for about 7 years, and then my wife's mother, my wife Sheila grew up in South Florida in Homestead, and she grew up on a farm. And we got the word in maybe late in 2007, when I was still teaching in Santa Cruz, that Evelyn, Sheila's mom, had been diagnosed with Parkinson's. And so Sheila's always been the go-to person in her family. And so we realized we needed to move from California to Florida to help take care of Sheila's mom, which we did. Now, I didn't know at the time, I just started thinking about the job market, what types of jobs are there in the Southeast right now. So believe it or not, I got a call the same day from David Colburn. And David had been the provost at the University of Florida, and he had retired by then, I believe, or he was just finishing out his term. You could go back and look at this. This would have been in 2008, I believe, beginning of 2008. And he called out of the blue. I knew him because David went to grad school the same time my PhD advisor, Bill Chafe, went to grad school.
Okay.
And so I had met Dave when I was a grad student at Duke coming down here to do my dissertation research. And so he called me and he said, hey, this is David Colburn. We haven't talked for a while. And I said, Dr. Colburn, it's great to hear from you. And the first question he had for me was, Paul, I'm kind of surprised. Why haven't you applied for this position at the Proctor program? And I said, I didn't know. What position is it? And he said, it's the director's position. And I said, oh, I thought Julian Pleasance was the director. And he said, oh, Julian's retiring next year. And so I was like, okay. And, you know, I thought about it for about 10 seconds. You know, I said, well, okay, I'll go ahead and apply, you know. And I got a call from a couple other faculty at UF. Bob Ziegler was another one. And he said, Paul, we really would like you to apply for this position. So long story short, Sheila and I eventually moved down here. And we, you know, I inherited a program which was very strong, except for the fact that it had been without a director for a year. And we didn't really work with that many students because Sam Proctor had retired several years earlier. Sam passed away around 2006. And he had retired before that, and he had stopped teaching the grad seminar in oral history. There weren't many oral history undergraduate courses being offered at all. And so my first job here, I felt, was getting students involved back into the program. And in fact, my first year, we had one intern, and that intern was none other than Sarah McNamara, who now is an assistant professor at Texas A&M University, just finished her first book on Ybor City. Sarah was a brilliant intern, and she was a go-getter. She just had great energy, excellent interviewer, great researcher, of course. But I realized, again, you know, you can't just have a university program with one student. And so shortly after that, we developed the graduate, no, I'm sorry, not the graduate, although I did teach a couple of graduate oral history seminars, but we developed primarily an undergraduate oral history, a community-based oral history internship. Because I really wanted the Proctor program to on a regular basis offer courses for undergraduates and graduate students if they wanted to take them, but also emphasize community-based oral history and field work. And there's a lot of great oral history programs throughout the world that teach the craft of oral history and do it really well. But the focus is really on kind of bringing a person in to be interviewed, doing that interview, maybe transcribing it, processing it, maybe publishing it, and then moving on to the next project. So the model I learned when I was a graduate student, and the model that I kind of learned from people like Jacqueline Hall at UNC Chapel Hill, you know, and other people was, why not be more community-based where you work over a long period of time with a community, a region, a neighborhood. It doesn't have to be the exact same people. It's going to change over time. And so our Mississippi Freedom program, for example, we started in '08. When we began that, and it involved me taking students to the Mississippi Delta to do oral histories with elders who've been involved in the freedom movement. At that point, many of them were sons and daughters of people that I'd interviewed in the Delta in the 90s. Now, over time, they passed away also. But the point is, the community-based approach is a little different than just kind of, you know, bringing a person in, doing a one-off interview, and that's kind of it. We do that too. But I really want to emphasize the community-based nature of the program, the fieldwork nature of the program. I've had so many students who have come in here, especially grad students and undergrads, who say, you know, I'm just so bored with my seminar. I probably shouldn't say that on tape. Or, you know, I just want to get out of the classroom, I want to get off campus. And those are the types of students that we often attract.
All right, so that's very interesting because you mentioning the community-based nature of the program and etc., and your own trajectory and how this contributed to the work you're doing in the program. That leads us to one of our questions here that is related to the original mission of the program and how has that mission evolved over time.
Yeah.
So what can you say about the mission of the program and how has that mission really evolved over time?
Well, it's a really good question, and I would preface my answer by saying that the people that often end up, the academic people who end up in university-based oral history programs tend to be the people who are identified with like dissent, the troublemakers, the people out of, my grad advisor called me out of phase. You know, he would say, you know, Paul, you're kind of out of phase with your cohort. And those are the types of people that end up in oral history. You know, I think my dear colleagues wouldn't object to that, because those of us who end up being directors of programs, we kind of pride ourselves on creating spaces for students who we can kind of recognize as being the students who are not satisfied with the status quo. They want to get out there. They want to try to find answers to problems. It's like I tell students, or I tell community members whenever I do an oral history lecture, like a basic oral history lecture, look, if you believe everything the state, your boss, your priest believes you or tells you, if you believe everything they tell you, there's probably no reason for you to do oral history. But if you have questions, if you think, well, you know, I think things may be more complicated, or there's something going on in this community or this society that doesn't make sense, you know, oral history is for you, you know. And just like, you know, we're recognizing Vivian Filer here, her 85th birthday. She's an incredible local historian, co-founder of the Cotton Club Museum. And Mrs. Filer is a person who grew up during segregation, and she tells us about how divided and unequal this community was. And to me, that's the kind of person who is really the ideal oral historian. Let me repeat your question again.
How has the mission of the program evolved over time?
Okay.
Thinking about the original mission, how has the mission evolved over time?
Okay, yeah. So I want to talk about Sam Proctor a little bit, because it was very important that the first director of our program was a Jewish intellectual. Sam had to deal with a lot of anti-Semitism on campus. He began teaching here at a time when there's very few Jewish faculty or students here. And the history of anti-Semitism in the U.S., I mean, the U.S. was founded as an anti-Semitic society, and that's only marginally changed over time. And so Sam, if you look at the early big marquee projects, it's not a mistake that they're with Native Americans. They're with people who were on the margins of the society many times. Now, Sam, you know, he loved to interview people like Bob Graham. Sam interviewed every governor in Florida that was, you know, up to the time Sam retired, I think.
Wow.
So he wasn't opposed to interviewing kind of the powerful people, the kind of the usual suspects that you would imagine. And we have a lot of oral histories with very prominent people in the collection. But Sam, if you read between the lines, Sam would interview people who had been victims of Klan violence, Ku Klux Klan violence. He would direct oral histories with African Americans at a time when there just wasn't that many oral histories with black people in Florida. And he worked with Joel Buchanan. Joel Buchanan was someone who worked with Vivian Filer. Joel had been in that first cohort of 4 black students to integrate Gainesville High School back in 1964, I believe. And, you know, had been, you know, the white teachers told him he was stupid. You know, his fellow white students beat him up, spit on him. And he was able to survive that, and he came out of that kind of baptism of fire, if you will, just passionate about historical truth and reconciliation. And so he connected with Sam Proctor and Joel in the early 80s, 1980s, did a project called the Fifth Avenue Blacks Collection. And it was primarily oral histories that Joel did with African American people in what used to be called like the Fifth Avenue neighborhood in Gainesville, predominantly black. And so, you know, you see the early values of the program really reflected in the topics that were chosen. Environmental history is the same kind of situation, where pretty early on we were doing oral histories on the, you know, Florida's threatened waterways. and questioning the ways in which the environment was being treated in Florida. And so when I kind of inherited all that in 2008, I came into a program that had those traditions of questioning, of letting our students go out and do their own work with an open mind. One example that I think fits in really well with your question about trajectory, if you think about the early oral histories we did with Native Americans, for example, and they were of mixed quality. Some were really good, some were not, so good. We're working now with the Doris Duke Charitable Trust and the original tribes and nations that we work with, Indian nations, to repatriate many of the interviews. And so, for example, when we started doing those oral histories in the early 70s, the idea was that universities like Illinois, like Florida, like Utah, et cetera, would go out, and then we would take these interviews and we would be the repositories of Native American history.
Okay.
And that sounds good on one level, but on another level, it's like colonialism. It's exactly how the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the others gather knowledge about indigenous peoples in order to manage them or control them. So the trajectory there is now in 2023, we're beginning to repatriate some of those oral histories with tribes or nations that have requested them back. So for example, the Catawba people in the South, they have said, we're just very grateful you did the interviews in the early 70s because you preserved our elders' voices when we didn't have the resources to do it ourselves. But now it's really time to give that knowledge back to where it came from. So that's what we're doing now. That's an example of you mentioned a trajectory and a tradition that we've established here. And so we've learned over time. We've made a lot of mistakes. Another example of a trajectory would be the interviews our students did at the inauguration of President Donald Trump, because soon after the election day in 2016, a lot of students were coming to us, coming to me, coming to women's studies and saying, how could we have elected this individual who bragged about abusing women and who bragged about doing all sorts of, petty crimes, essentially. How on earth could we have elected this person? And a couple of us, faculty said, well, look, instead of asking us, why don't you ask the people who supported them or supported him, Donald Trump? And furthermore, why don't you go and do the things we do in oral history, create an interview guide, do some research, and then go and try to create a dialogue with these individuals. And so Women's Studies and the oral history program got together. Women's Studies found a donor who supported a field trip, and we sent 2 van loads of students up to Washington, D.C., to interview people at the Women's March. The Women's March was kind of a counter-protest, counter-inaugural, if you will, against the Trump inauguration. But we also interviewed a lot of people who are pro-Trump. And because the turnout for the 2016 inauguration of President Trump was so low, our students had the chance to actually get into, they were like right there near the podium where President Trump spoke. And so they interviewed people, some of the groups, one of them was Latinos for Trump. Another group was, I think, Bikers for Trump, Jesus Christ for Trump, all these different groups. And so the interviews are really powerful. And they fulfill a mission that we have in oral history, which is to connect to people who we don't necessarily normally talk to. Age differences. We're still a very segregated society. Language differences, religious differences, class differences. So that's what we try to do in the oral history program, is bring people together.
Well, that's very, very interesting and it's great to hear about these experiences and missions of the program, because that leads to one of the questions we have, the core questions we have here about the social impact of the program and the importance of the program, because SPOHP is known for it's a strong connection to social justice issues, right? So could you explain how oral history can be a tool for advancing social justice and equity, and also talk about the social impact of that the semiopractor oral history program has had on the University of Florida and community, like regional, local, and national community, because we know that SPOHP has like a national coverage, right? Has a national importance in terms of having projects not only in Florida, not only at UF, but also in other states.
Right. Well, I think it's a very important question. It's very broad, and it gets back to, I can think of different types of oral history projects that we've done. When I think of our environmental work, for example, I think of 5 words which shock many Americans. Water is a finite resource. Many Americans are so shocked when you say water is a finite resource, because they believe that, some of them, not all of them, but some of them believe that water is unlimited, right? And our interviews have been able to show that no, water is not unlimited, and that some communities have more access to those natural resources than other communities. We've done some really good work on environmental justice issues, and this really goes back many years. I think in terms of more recently, as you know, there have been a lot of states passing laws trying to ban Black studies, gender studies, critical race theory, the 1619 history curriculum. The Proctor program has played a major role in really supporting intellectual freedom during this time when intellectual freedom is under siege. And so one concrete example was in February, students all over the state of Florida organized a walkout in support of Black studies, because the state had just announced it was banning or censoring the advanced placement African American studies curriculum on the high school level. And so we didn't think that the governor of Florida is qualified to do that. I mean, the governor of Florida is qualified to run the state of Florida. He's not qualified to teach Black studies. And so our students basically said, what can the oral history program do to step up to support the traditions of Black studies at this present time? And so what we did was we sponsored a 3-hour teach-in on Black studies. Not as, we weren't trying to like say in your face Florida or in your face Ron DeSantis, but the goal was to highlight the great work that we've done in Black history and Black studies over the decades, and to give students and people in the community an access to those resources, to those interviews, to the public programs, to the workshops. And the title, I love the title of the teach-in. It was called Can't Ban Us, a teach-in on Black studies. We've done a lot of work also with farm worker communities, and my colleague Adolfo Romero did an internship and even an MA thesis, working primarily with the Farm Worker Association in Florida, which is based in Apopka in kind of central Florida. And there, the goal has been to remind people over and over again about issues involving, labor exploitation, toxicity, pesticide, the impact of pesticides on people's systems and communities. But again, also to say this is a community-based project. This is not just about UF students going in. Like, we've had a couple of our internships working with the Farm Workers Association. But the idea is that the students created podcasts that the Farm Workers Association could use for their own purposes. So not just interviewing people and taking the knowledge back and writing a senior thesis or dissertation, but trying to create materials that communities can really use for their benefit. So I think that that all kind of gets back to the social justice mission. It's a scary word for a lot of people now. They don't like the word social justice. And I've had some of my administrative colleagues ask me, does it have to be social justice, Paul? And could it be something else like equity or something? Well, even equity now is a bad word, right? And so it turns out nothing is safe these days. But, we emphasize social justice because it kind of gets back to, and I'll say too, we do have a bias or biases. And it is very important to understand as a researcher and as a writer, what your biases are. And so if you look at the collections, the strengths are in things like Native American history, working class history, African American history. We've interviewed a lot of people who have, picked crops for most of their lives, worked as custodians, worked as teachers, worked as small farmers. And so that's a bias right there. And our bias, I think, is that we have kind of a working class bias in the sense that, again, we love to interview people in positions of power. We did an interview with Jeb Bush, former Governor Jeb Bush, just a year and a half ago, I believe. So we're not opposed to those types of interviews, but we really want to get to the grassroots to talk to people. And I think that's, when people say social justice, I think that's really what they mean is, oh, you're interviewing people who are not powerful people, but oftentimes people who have strong critiques of the system, not because they want to just, throw darts, but because they're asking for fundamental changes. We've interviewed farm workers and they've asked us point blank, if this society says it rewards hard work, why are our communities so poor? Please, can you explain this to us? Mm-hmm. So that is a social justice perspective right there. It's asking a question. Why poverty? Why the lack of affordable housing? We have a lot of interviews where people talk about those issues. What are those things rooted in? And so, from an oral historian's perspective, if you ask me, if you were a reporter and you say, Professor Ortiz, can you tell me why the eastern part of Gainesville, well, two questions. Can you tell me why a University of Florida student comes here from Fort Lauderdale or from Collier County, and they're here 1 week on campus, and I use the term East Gainesville, and they know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about black people. How is that? How is that knowledge created? My response is, I'm a historian, I'll tell you how it was created historically. And then if you ask me a connected question, why is there so much poverty in Black and Latino communities in our region, then that's where my work begins. That's where oral history can tell us. It's not the only source, of course, but it gives us the subjective perspective from the perspective of a worker to tell us, well, why has there been this poverty that you can trace back to the 1960s, the 1930s, the 1830s, the 1730s, And so that's I think, the social justice perspective. And I think it goes back to Sam Proctor, because if you look at our collections, we have a lot of oral histories with Holocaust survivors, with Jewish people who fled Nazi Germany. We have a large number of interviews that were donated to us of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany who built a community in San Salvador, in El Salvador, in Central America. And we even did a documentary film on this a number of years ago for the Center for Latin American Studies annual conference.
Wow.
And again, the emphasis is the social justice emphasis. And it begins with a question: why did a small nation step up to do something that the United States, France, Great Britain, and the other so-called democracies refused to do? That is, welcome refugees, welcome the outsider, welcome the desperate person into their society. Why did El Salvador do this on such a basis when the U.S., you had to just about, there's all sorts of, the most recent documentary, the Ken Burns documentary, U.S. and the Holocaust, is an indictment on the society. It says that, well, yes, the U.S. did accept a certain number of refugees, Jewish refugees, but in many cases, they're the most prominent individuals. I mean, who wouldn't accept Albert Einstein? I mean, I don't give the U.S. credit for that, right? But what about all of the passengers on the St. Louis, an enormous ship? You know, what about all the people who tried to get into the U.S. from Germany from 1933 onward that were rejected and who died in concentration or death camps? What about those people? So that's a social justice question right there. And Ken Burns did what, of course, on a much larger canvas, what we've been trying to do for many years, which the Holocaust Museum in the U.S. and the one in Israel does as well, which is to give privilege to the voices of the survivors, of the people who ask the hard questions. You say you're a democracy. You say you're a society of immigrants, and yet you betrayed us at the most important point in modern history when you could have lived out those values. Why? You know, not to just, you know, kind of poke the country in the eye, but to say, well, what about now? You know, what about the situation, connect the experience of Jewish people in Nazi Germany in the 30s with the experience of immigrants or refugees from East Africa or from Mexico or from, you know, Eastern Europe or wherever the case may be. So asking difficult questions, oftentimes, that's why the term social justice is very unpopular, especially in people in power, because people in power want us to believe the system works. Maybe you have to fine tune it a little bit, but by and large it works. But when you talk to the average person on the street, they give you a very different perspective.
Wow, that's amazing. That's really amazing, because that makes me to think about lots of projects we're doing here right now in the program, right? To think about them from the perspective of social justice.
Yeah.
You know, so I have two more questions for you. One of them, and thinking about what you just said about social justice and about the connection between the program and social justice issues. In your opinion, what makes the semiopractor history program unique and important? Or in other words, why SPOHP matters?
Yeah. Students. Everything that we've been talking about is only made possible by the fact that we have scores and scores of students who want to ask these tough questions. Some of them come from backgrounds where they suspect they haven't been given the whole truth about the society. And they end up doing these wonderful senior thesis projects, these wonderful dissertations, these wonderful MA thesis projects. Like earlier I was talking about Adolfo Romero. And Adolfo did his MA in Latin American Studies here, working primarily with the Farm Workers Association in Papca. And so that association asks really tough questions of the society. And as we've discussed before, and Adolfo is the kind of student, and he first arrived here when he was an MA student in Latin American Studies at UF. He's the I would say, the paragon or the example or the exemplar of the kind of student that comes in through the doors here. I think of people like Justin Dunavant, who's now an assistant professor at UCLA in anthropology. I think again of Sarah McNamara, or I think of Hennessy Laura, who's starting as an assistant professor at UC Irvine this fall. She grew up hearing her elders talking about the revolution in the Dominican Republic in 1964-65. But she also grew up hearing about the U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic to stop that revolution. And so she ended up, when she was here, she did incredible oral history work. She helped start our, back then I think we called it the Latino Diaspora in the South or in the Americas Project. And Hennessy's Laura is again an example of the kind of student who comes in, who asks tough questions that don't provide easy answers, and that you're going to have to spend months and years trying to resolve. When I think of the work that she did, and then later I worked with her, and you worked with her, as when she was a postdoctoral scholar on the Created Unequal project with Dr. Ibram Kendi. And that project allowed us to take what we've learned at the oral history program here at UF and kind of apply it on a more national or even hemispheric wide level. But it all really comes down to the students. And look, if students started coming here and saying, we're very satisfied, we believe everything our parents tell us, the society is working just fine, then we'd have a very different kind of oral history program. Then you could remove the social justice and just say, we're celebrating the canvas of American life. And then we'd be more like a standard U.S. history textbook, like the kind that I learned that I read as a kid, but that I never took seriously. Because one of the things you'll find out with most high school students in the United States of America, and this is how you test the health of the society, ask them what they think of history as a topic. And 8 or 9 out of 10 will tell you history is boring. It is so boring, I'm so glad I don't have to study it anymore. But we make it boring at the high school level, middle school level, to avoid asking the difficult questions. Okay, so we don't have to, the U.S. is a federal system. We normally don't have to ban things. We just make them so boring people don't want to look into them, Yes. Only recently though have we begun to ban a lot of things again. So again, this is kind of a long-winded answer to your very direct question. Our programs are driven, our projects I should say, are really driven by the types of students and communities that we work with. I rarely have very affluent leaders of gated communities coming in to tell me, or to ask me, please do an oral history of my affluent gated community in South Florida, in, say, Palm Beach. And the reason is that powerful people really don't want you looking behind the scenes. They don't want you learning how they got their wealth and power. FYI, by the way. I'm writing a book now on earlier U.S. history about how some of these fortunes were made, and the terms corruption, cupidity, are used quite often in early U.S. history, not by the radicals, but by people in the mainstream. How did these railroads get all this land? How did these, people will say, this is an aside, but it's something that really piqued my interest last night. At 2 a.m. I was reading a book, and it talked about enclosure of land. Now, I'm familiar with enclosure from studying European history, and I'm working on a book on settler colonialism. And so this book challenged me. It was published in 1910. And the author was saying that the amount of land enclosed in states like Wyoming, Montana, California is staggering. It's it's hundreds of millions of acres enclosed. Entire counties where the only person that lives there is the rancher and cattle. And maybe there's a copper mine, maybe there's a lead mine, maybe there's a gold mine, right? Or a coal mine, whatever the case may be. But the way that person got that land was through bribery, corruption, and pretending, because the U.S. had laws to say that, you could get, 1,000 acres if you could prove that you were bringing settlers to settle on the land. Well, that's settler colonialism, right? Except for the fact that in many cases, that wasn't done. The guy just got the land. He just got the 1,000 acres or the 1,000,000 acres, like a railroad's got. Each individual railroad got 10 million plus acres, and no one living on that land. I mean, you could drive through entire parts of the U.S. right now and not see a single living person for like 2 or 3 days in a row. And so that's an odd kind of settler colonialism. Where are the settlers? Okay, and so that's a hint on the kind of corruption that really defines like earlier U.S. history. And we're interviewing people now, talk about Native American people. I mean, they can tell us how that story unfolded. Our people used to live in those big empty places now, but now it's a uranium mine, it's a coal mine, it's a great ranch, you know, thousands of heads of cattle, you know. Mexican American people in the Southwest can tell us, yeah, my ancestors used to own this land. Now we're landless sharecroppers or copper miners. My grandfather owned this land, but now it's owned by the Phelps Dodge Corporation. Okay, well, how did that happen? It didn't happen by hard work, I can tell you that. And so the people that we want to talk to are the people that, yes, have been dispossessed, the people who have been refugees, the people who are kind of working class people, the most recent projects during COVID. Let's talk to the so-called essential workers. What are their experiences? Let's talk to frontline, you know, healthcare workers. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I know we have no much time. So I'll go to our last question, which is a very important one, especially given your position as the director of the program. So looking to the future, where do you see the semiopractor history program heading in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah.
And what are some of the program's goals moving forward?
Yeah. Well, collaboration is the key. We want to increase the number of universities, of communities, of students that we work with. And it's kind of growing our program. And so we focus on things like an outreach list, public programs. We would like to do, I would like us to do in the future, a higher number of public programs that maybe don't take as much energy. Because public programs are very challenging to do, but I think if we're doing our jobs properly, the public program is a great way of getting the word out there. So we're not just selfishly doing the interview, doing the research and saying, hey, I'm going to write a senior thesis or dissertation out of this. We're saying that this knowledge belongs to the entire community, the entire region, the entire state or nation or world for that matter. So I think trying to find ways to do that more effectively, I think trying to find ways to get our oral histories into the public schools, K through 12 schools, is very important for us to continue doing. I think that trying to find a way that students here learn about our program when they're freshmen instead of when they're seniors. We love the seniors, but oftentimes, because of the way we work, students don't learn about our program until they're juniors, rising juniors or seniors. We just started a great project called the Underground Railroad Project, where we're interviewing descendants of freedom seekers and conductors of the Underground Railroad. And we had a high school student who is hoping to matriculate to the University of Florida, who contacted us, who said, hey, can I participate in this incredibly exciting project where you're interviewing descendants of Underground Railroad activists? And we said, sure. And so he actually sat in on the interview that we did with Robert Seeley, who's the descendant of Thomas Garrett, who helped free over 2,000 African Americans from slavery, an incredible hero in American history. And so it was so exciting to have a high school student sit in with us on the interview. And I'm hoping that we can do more of that. You know, we can work more with high schools, middle schools. I don't have those skill sets, but you know, there are plenty of other colleagues around us who have worked as teachers. We just welcomed into the program a new former undergraduate, Robert Smalls, has been a substitute teacher And so we want more people with those types of skill sets that can connect us, that can make the circle wider and wider, kind of spread the word of oral history. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor
Thank
Ortiz,
you.
for having
Thank you,
me,
Ella. I
for
really appreciate it.
answering to these questions. I think it's very important for me personally to learn more about the program, but also for the program itself, for the legacy of the program. It's been an honor to be here working with the semiopractor history program, and to learn more about the program is always great. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for interviewing me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.